Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Hey guys, original link to the video, top of the description. Let's learn. That's what we do, usually. Preemptive like William C. Fox. Do a subscribe. What if Canada joined the European Union? Let's go.
An artificial line right through it between Canada and the U.S. Just a straight artificial line. Somebody did it a long time ago.
Troubles with
Isn't that most borders?
the United States have led to suggestions that Canada could become the European Union's 28th member.
Well, you could say that for about any border. It's like, oh, hey, this line, it was just a man-made line, Then it doesn't exist.
Canada isn't even in Europe, you say. But if you look at it from this angle, well, okay, Canada still isn't in Europe, but it also isn't as disconnected from the continent as standard maps make it seem. Consider that a recent poll suggested more Canadians support the idea of joining the EU than oppose. Obviously not conclusive, but it speaks to
Wow.
openness to unprecedented ideas in unprecedented times. So what challenges would Canada face joining the EU in increasing order of difficulty? If Canada joined the European Union, it would immediately become the 5th largest member by population, 39 million. Currently, Germany is the EU member with the most people, 84 million, about double Canada's population. France is currently the largest by area, 540,000 square kilometers or 210,000 square miles. If Canada joined, it would be far and away the largest EU country by area, roughly 10 million square kilometers.
I'm always slightly surprised that France is larger than Sweden, but I know with Mercator projection maps, the more north you get, the more skewed your size is, so...
kilometers or 3.8 million square miles. In fact, Canada is over double the size of the current European Union, meaning that adding Canada as 28th member would triple the geographic area of the European Union. But come on, Canada is not on the European continent, so how in the world could it be part of the European Union? The so-called Copenhagen criteria for EU enlargement has other prerequisites to joining the EU, such as democratic institutions, rule of law, a functioning market economy, the willingness and ability to comply with EU law. You'll notice being on the European continent is not a formal requirement to join. Article 49 of the Treaty on the EU says being a, quote, European state is a requirement, but the term European state is left undefined. Part of the process of negotiating accession is determining if a state is sufficiently European. So might Canada qualify in a stretched definition of a European state based on heritage and its head of state? We'll get back to that. But let's not
But then you can argue that, like, Australia... Okay.
just pass over the raw geography here because, yeah, most of the EU's countries are indeed on the continent and share a land border. Ireland, Cyprus, and Malta are EU members that don't share a land border with another EU country, but nonetheless, their relative proximity allows ease of trade and movement of people. If, just for the sake of argument, New Zealand were to consider joining the European Union, the challenge of being so very far away would surely complicate that conversation, even if we consider New Zealand's European links. And that's especially true due to the geographic nature of defense policy, which we'll get to. One way to overcome the geographic issue for Canada is to simply turn the globe and realize that Canada isn't that far away. Cape Columbia, Canada's northernmost point, is only 2,400 kilometers away from Norgum, Finland, 1,500-ish miles. That's half the distance.
And it's right next to Danish territory of Greenland.
Between New York and California. The distance between St. John's, Canada and Dublin is about the same as between Dublin and Cyprus. You can fly from Helsinki, Finland to Lisbon, Portugal within the EU in about 4.5 hours. And similarly, you can go from Montreal to Lisbon in 6.5 hours. It's different, but nothing crazy. Between Canada and the European Union are also Iceland, Greenland, the United Kingdom, Norway. While not EU member states, they are all closely linked to the EU. Take all these places in EU orbit and add Canada, and it starts to look like a genuinely formidable bloc. With a tripled territory, there would be a lot more land and sea to defend. On the other hand, the EU and Canada would become unified players in the Arctic at a crucial moment. So that's one piece here. Canada joining the EU is a bit of a stretch geographically, but let's return to the more challenging direct question. Could Canada qualify under Article 49 as a European state? Canada is right above the United States, and it feels like it. Canadian English and American English are hard to distinguish, and a lot of Canadian culture is based on finding ways to distinguish from America because the similarities can be so overwhelming. So yeah, at first glance, Canada joining the EU is about as odd as the United States joining the EU. Oceans and cultures divide, but Canada is a country with European roots, Western European to be specific. Now, I don't want to step into a big debate about colonialism, but suffice it to say that the British and French empires left their marks on Canada in ways that remain culturally and politically relevant, arguably more relevant than the legacy of those empires in the United States. And thus, Canada is a country that could plausibly join the EU and fit right in culturally. In Quebec, people tend to identify as Canadian, but also as a distinct Quebecois with deep French ties. If you were dropped in Quebec City or Montreal, you'd be forgiven for thinking you were in Europe. And French is one of the official languages of Canada, required for civil servants. French
like 5-6 years ago, maybe, me, my dad, and my brother went up to hike a mountain called Mount Katahdin, which is the northernmost stretch of the Appalachians. It's actually one of the two ends of the giant Appalachian Trail. And I remember us meeting people from Quebec at the top, and we interacted with each other and like had helped each other take pictures and whatnot, but we were completely separated from language just as much as if we were when we were in France, you know? And so it was a cool experience just seeing how close we are in this like sea of English that I usually see North America as, not counting Mexico, that there were people so close that we didn't speak the same language. It's pretty fascinating.
Which, by the way, is one of the two most prominent languages in the EU's bureaucracy. The other is English, and of course most Canadians speak English thanks to British colonialism. But it's not just cultural, it's also political. Over the years, most of Canada has proudly demanded to keep the British monarch as head of state, even when becoming a dominion in the late 1800s. Contrast that with the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921, where the main sticking point for Irish Republicans was revulsion at keeping the King of England as their head of state. It caused the Irish Civil War. Canada hasn't been like that. The Governor General still represents the British monarch's interests in Canada, albeit ceremonially, and Canada has a parliament and prime minister, modeled off the Westminster system. Now, these two European components, French Canada and Anglo Canada, don't always see eye to eye. For example, French Canada was not universally enthused when Canada joined World Wars I and II alongside the UK, but still, Canada joined World Wars I and II long before the United States, because of their deep ties to the UK and Europe. In fact, in World War I, Canada was automatically joined in the war when the UK declared. To hit home this point, I asked my friend Elise for a little help. I met her when I was working at the German embassy, and she was a French diplomat here in DC. Her thesis was coincidentally about Canada and the Great Wars in Europe. So my question to you is, admitting that it is a bit of a stretch, because of Canada's roots in the British and French Empire, because of the way they participated in World War I and II, is there an argument to be made that Canada is more European than it first appears?
Well, it does have a more connected history to Europe that America can have, because America somehow, like in his identity national building story, is all about breaking the chains with Europe. Where Canadians, until very recently, and I think still nowadays, if you have a visit of the royals, there's a strong feeling. Actually, on the coins in Canada, you can still have the Queen and some of the symbolism. So there is a strong history with that. Now, Canada has only one border, and that's still a pretty big difference with any European country. But I like your
Ireland,
comparison,
Denmark.
and I think in many ways Canada could be the Switzerland of North America.
So the bottom line is that for history, for culture, for blood, Canada isn't as far from a European state as you'd initially think.
Sure. And I know there were conflicts between America and Canada in our earlier days, right? But my point, I'm raising my hand here, I don't really know why. is the Europe, I think this relies upon this question, and a question I'm interested in. Is the European Union more of a namesake of, is the European Union more about a close Europe, or is it more of just an economic relationship that happens to be in Europe with European as its namesake? And the reason that's a big difference to me is that if it is more about Europe itself, then it would be less of a case for Canada joining. But if it's more of just a namesake of a economic partnership in Europe, then I don't see a big deal about Canada joining if they want to join and the current European Union states want them to join. You know what I mean? So that's a big difference. Is it more about Europe itself, or is Europe just more of a namesake for an economic alliance that could include Canada if they wanted to join and if they were accepted, you know?
Sure, it's a stretch, but there's a lot of subtlety here, and those deciding an application would get to engage with that subtlety because this would be legally unprecedented. I mentioned the UK several times. You probably already have thought, well, the UK left the European Union, so doesn't that cancel out one of Canada's European ties? To that I say, meh. The bottom line is that despite the fact that Canada joining the EU seems at first to be quite random, it's not, as we've seen, neither geographically nor culturally. But now things get even more complicated. Canada potentially joining the EU cannot be truly understood without addressing the sticky issue of defense.
Kind of like with the term the NATO being the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Well, Turkey is in NATO. And unless you want to call the Mediterranean part of the North Atlantic, then maybe there's your case. But I don't really consider them. And so it's more of just a namesake rather than a requirement. And I wonder if it's similar with the EU.
There's broad overlap between members of the European Union and members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, a defense alliance founded in 1949 and traditionally led by the United States. In fact, 23 of the EU's 27 member states are also in NATO. But of course, NATO and the European Union are not the same thing. There are members of the EU that are not in NATO, and there are members of NATO that are not in the EU. For example, Canada is in NATO, but not in the EU. So what would it mean for Canada to join the European Union now as a pre-existing member of NATO? Well, nothing. Sort of. Defense treaties as they exist today aren't the problem. Canada is in NATO, as are many European member states. If Canada joined the European Union, it would simply be another member in both institutions. The complication comes from growing US skepticism of the NATO alliance. What if the US formally leaves the NATO alliance? Or even, as things stand, what if a NATO country is attacked and the Commander-in-Chief of the United States orders the military to ignore any invocation of Article 5 for mutual defense? Because President Trump, Vice President Vance, and the Secretary of Defense have left lots of...
Isn't Article 5 the main reason for NATO in the first place? I mean, I assume NATO is not just a military trading organism. If you're not going to back up Article 5, why are you in NATO in the first place? You know, so I know he's trying to make a scenario here.
Because
but this seems like even more of a reason for Canada to think about joining the EU, seeing how you can be less dependent on the USA, depending on who's in power, and it would kind of be a middle finger to the USA if the USA is giving a middle finger to you right now. Then I know I'm acting like it's an easy process to just get into the EU. I just don't see this point as a reason to say they wouldn't.
Of Article 5 for mutual defense. Because President Trump, Vice President Vance, and the Secretary of Defense have left lots of open questions in the room about the U.S. fulfilling its treaty obligations, the EU has recently voted to empower member states to spend additional hundreds of billions on their own defense. Large European countries like Germany and France no longer only speak about meeting 2% of GDP for defense spending, as is expected for NATO, but as the head of NATO put it, considerably more than 3%. Which some countries like Poland are already exceeding. It leads to a larger question for the European Union, one that...
So when he says that about the EU making it okay for countries to spend more on defense, that kind of sounds like well, the EU has nothing to do with defense. Are they just saying that the EU is going to lower financial obligations to the EU, some economic obligations, in order so countries can spend that on military?
That I remember countries like Poland are already exceeding. It leads to a larger question for the European Union, one that I remember being batted around during my time at an EU member embassy here in Washington. Given the unprecedented threats from Russia and mixed messages from Trump, should the EU have its own military? Not just the German military or the Dutch military or the Estonian military, but a single entity controlled by Brussels. French President Emmanuel Macron called for such a true European army back in 2018 and has recently floated the idea of extending France's nuclear deterrent to its European allies. Which brings us to Canada. If Canada were to join the EU, it would need to make a judgment call about the direction European defense is headed. If the EU maneuvers towards a joint defense strategy or joint defense forces, Canada would presumably be part. Might some of Canada's armed forces one day be under the umbrella of Brussels? And how does Canada feel about that? Admittedly, it's speculation on speculation, but decisions would need to be made. In exchange for being part of European defense, Canada would receive the same, which until recently sounded far-fetched and unnecessary, but President Trump said in February 2025 that he wasn't happy with the US-Canadian Treaty on borders. And of course, he's constantly insisted that Canada should become the 51st state. Nearly impossible to distinguish bloviating and trolling from legitimate threats, but here we are. So when I was writing the script, I had a hard time determining if these defense questions were trickier than the economic questions. But as of writing, these defense issues are mostly speculative. Meanwhile, the most complicated piece of the puzzle,
As if trolling is an excuse. I mean, when it comes to your own defense and your own borders, does it really... It's like, oh, I was joking. Well, you're joking about something extremely serious, and that's not an excuse.
Very real trade war playing out between the US, Canada, Europe, and the rest of the world. The U.S. trade war and renegotiations of USMCA are the most pressing reasons Canada may consider the heretofore unconsidered idea of joining the European Union. If the economic relationship enjoyed between the U.S. and Canada hits the rocks any harder, Canada will likely want new deals with reliable trading partners. The same goes in reverse for the European Union, as news of American tariffs move faster than headlines can keep up. Of course, if Canada were to join the EU, it would bring its $2.2 trillion economy with it, and by joining it would become the fourth largest economy by gross domestic product. The EU as a bloc is already Canada's third largest trading partner. Bring Canada into the European Union, make them part of the single market for goods and services, exchange free movement of people, the EU may soon rank even higher. But there's a lot of assumptions there. First, that Canada joining the EU wouldn't affect trade with the UK, another large Canadian trading partner, which has of course left the EU. Second, because beginning accession negotiations to the European Union requires unanimous support from all 27 member states, Canada would need to hope none of its exports were threatening to domestic European firms that could then lean on their home governments to block Canada's accession. For example, a 2017 free trade agreement between Canada and the EU has yet to be fully implemented all these years later because 10 EU countries refused to ratify it. The entire EU would have to be serious about having Canada. But these economic details seem minor compared to this. As of now, about 77% of Canadian exports head to the United States. The Canadian government calls it, quote, the most extensive trading relationship. We are each other's largest trading partners. Canada and the US are part of USMCA, formerly NAFTA, a free trade agreement between Mexico, Canada, and the United States.
He made this in his first term, or he was a part of this in his first term, and now he's upset, which is crazy.
Even if the Trump administration unilaterally sabotages the USMCA with tariffs, it would still be incredibly difficult for Canada to replace the volume of its free trade from the United States to Europe. Nonetheless, EU and Canadian officials have pledged to have each other's backs as Trump's trade war intensifies. And Canada has aimed to increase its non-US exports by 50%, according to Reuters, and a lot of that would be the European Union. In the meantime, there are initial murmurs of a European movement in Canada, and writers from the BBC and CBC and Economist have indulged the idea, like I'm now doing. Europe needs space and resources, read an Economist headline. Canada needs people. Let's deal. Some minor officials chimed in to endorse the conversation, and Germany's prominent former foreign minister, Sigmar Gabriel, said that the EU should indeed invite Canada to join. When news of that poll I mentioned, showing 44% of respondents thought Canada should join the EU, EU. A European Commission spokesperson said the EU was honored, though she said she wouldn't comment further. On that note, is Canada joining the EU realistic or just wild speculation? I thought about that a lot, and
It can be somewhere in the middle, right?
part of the reason I decided to go ahead and write this is because the realm of possibilities has expanded in recent months. The world is realigning, and fast. Something unthinkable. Canada joining the EU, perhaps literally not even having been conceived until recently. It's now out there as something people are talking about. That said, realignment with Europe is more likely than literally joining. It's not likely, at least not a formal joining of Canada becoming the 28th member of the European Union. But what is more realistic, almost guaranteed by the behavior of the United States, is closer alignment between Canada and the EU. Depending on how much the trade war and other disputes escalate, perhaps a partnership of a depth impossible in other circumstances.
That was really cool. I like his closing statement a lot there, in that, it's such a big process. You have to have all the EU people get approve, all the EU countries approve, and any negotiations between Canada and the EU or Canada and the US, or there are so many things that I think he put it well. Honestly, a full joining of the EU, it might be a nice thing to think about now, but it's something that I'm sure would take like a decade to materialize. Let me know if you think I'm wrong there. But I do think we are going through a transition. I think we are exiting the post-World War II world order. I think we're exiting it. And to be honest, I don't think it's just Trump that's causing that exit. I think it's been going on, where Europe was obviously devastated from World War II. The U.S. was enormous in the rebuilding and being a giant military force there, and having a lot to do with ties with diplomatic relations, economics. But I think we're reaching a time where Europe is no longer, it is now strong enough to come out of that post-World War II destruction, of that World War II destruction, to a post-World War II era. You know what I mean? And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's a natural progression of things. I think the way Trump is threatening Canada and Denmark is short-sighted and not smart. I think this is a very interesting concept, which may not be something that comes in reality anytime soon, and maybe not ever. But it is interesting to discuss it in the broader scope of this post-World War II era that I think we're entering in. So, very interesting. If you disagree with anything I said, call me out on it, please. Want nothing more than that. Any comments at all? Hope everyone's doing well, and hopefully I'll see you guys next time, and we'll keep on learning. Bye, guys.